I built a reversible two-sided O-gauge layout. The layout is designed to be placed underneath the Christmas tree during the holiday season, but when the holiday season is over, you can remove the structures, the trees, and other decorations, flip the layout over, reinstall the trees and other structures, and you have a summer-themed layout that you can leave up the remainder of the year. So when the holiday season is over, you don't have to put away your train layout. Anyway, let's see how I built this two-sided layout. So I started with a 42-inch by 62-inch piece of birch plywood that I had cut down at Home Depot where I bought the plywood. And I then cut off a 10-inch by 10-inch triangular piece off the end of each corner to help make it a roughly elongated octagonal shape. And the reason I did that was so it would be a little bit more flexible and fitting into certain corners depending on where we had it set up in the house. And also, this does make it a little bit more foot-friendly, so when it is placed underneath the Christmas tree, you don't have those sharp 90-degree corners that are more likely to catch your toes when you're walking by it. Plus, it just takes up a little bit less floor space, and that can be important depending on where you have the layout set up. Now, the next step was to build a frame around the perimeter of the layout. So I did this by taking clear 1x4 pine boards, and I cut those to fit around the perimeter of the layout. I cut a 22.5-degree bevel on each of the cuts, so when everything was assembled, it would make the octagonal shape. So I measured each piece of wood, cut it down to size, and then dry assembled it around the layout. For more support, I then took a 1/2-inch by 2-inch piece of poplar and cut that to fit on the inside of the pine boards, and this way I would have a lip there that the plywood could sit on top of for more structural support. So I cut down those poplar boards to fit on each of the pieces, and then I glued and screwed those poplar boards to the pine boards for each of the sections. So once all the edge pieces were cut, glued, and screwed together, I started gluing everything together to make the full layout base. I applied glue to the edges of each of those edge pieces. I ran glue along the lip where the plywood would sit on top of, and then worked my way around the layout, gluing all the pieces together and sticking them in place where they were to go. Once everything was press fit in place, I took my nail gun and started putting in 1.5-inch brads everywhere along the perimeter of the frame to help hold everything in place while the glue dried. Because the plywood base was cut from a 4x8 foot sheet, I did have an extra piece left over. So I also cut the corners off that remaining piece to match the overall shape of the main base itself. I applied a bunch of glue to the bottom of this piece of plywood and stuck it in place on top of the main base, getting everything centered, just using a piece of scrap wood as a gauge to make sure I had this extra piece of plywood fully centered on top of the main base. I just weighted everything down with a bunch of my batteries for my lawn tools and let that dry. The purpose of this extra piece of plywood was just to add a lot more structural support, just because the extra piece of plywood would really help prevent any bending or warping of the base. Now for the other side of the layout, I poured a bunch of glue on there and I fit in a piece of 1-inch insulation foam board that was cut to size to fit the shape of the layouts. And then I roughly assembled my selection of Atlas track. This is 036 track with a couple of straight pieces attached to each side. And I just roughly put that in place so I would have an idea of where the track was going to be. And then I cut another piece of foam board to fit in between that area of track. I also cut out a little alcove into that piece of foam to where I did plan to eventually build a small lake. I beveled the edges so they were roughly 45-degree angles to make it easier to do the scenery, and then I also glued that piece of foam in place. So at this point, I basically had two 1-inch pieces of insulation foam board along with 2 1/2-inch pieces of plywood all glued together. I did insert a few screws through all the foam into the plywood to help everything stay in place while I did additional work and the glue was still drying. For the feet of this layout, what I use are these wooden pieces that are used on the end of handrails on stairwells, and so I used those and glued and screwed those in place for the 4 feet on each of the sides of the layout. You could obviously use any piece of wood that you wanted to for the feet. In fact, it would have been a heck of a lot easier just to use square ones, but I just like the rounded shape of these. I did glue and screw those in place, and then it was time to work on the scenery. So on the wooden side of the layout, what I did was mix together a bunch of Sculptamold, paint, and glue, with the idea that I would have a really thick plastery paint that I could paint onto the layout, fill in all the gaps, and get everything a nice white color all in one go. Now, Sculptamold was a bad idea here, and what I really wanted to use was just plain plaster like hydrocal or regular plaster of Paris to create kind of a very thick paint that I would put on that would seal all the cracks and gaps in the wood and everything else and provide for a nice smooth coating for this side of the layout. Using Sculptamold, there's a lot of paper mache type product in there, which is just very lumpy and you can't make it very smooth. And so that wasn't really the best idea. So I took my gloved hands as well as a board and kind of scraped away all that paper mache material in this mixture and placed that around those feet on each of the 4 corners. Next, it was time to take the track out of this Harry Potter Hogwarts Express train set and assemble that track and press it in place into this wet mixture of plaster and paint and glue. Then I took a bunch of screws and screwed everything down in place as well. The combination of the screw and the glue will pretty much make sure this track never moves again. Since this was going to be a winter themed side of the layout, I took some white spray paint and sprayed all the track down with the white paint and then cleaned the glue off the rail heads before it dried. I painted on a layer of diluted white glue and then started sprinkling on plaster of Paris. What I really wanted to use here was hydrocal. I just couldn't get any at the time I was working on this layout. And hydrocal is a very bright white color, whereas plaster of Paris is a much more dull white color and doesn't look as much like snow. But the plaster did help to smooth out the gaps along the edge of the track and fill in some of those other gaps in different parts of the layout and smooth things out as I sprinkled that around the layout. I didn't apply any glue or water to the top of the plaster. I just let the diluted glue that I painted in place soak up through the plaster and bond it in place. Once I put everything in place, I just tilted up the layout and shook off all the extra plaster that didn't get stuck down to the glue. After cleaning up and letting that first layer dry, I went ahead and painted on another diluted mix of white glue to all the areas of the layout, and then sprinkled on a layer of Woodland Scenic's Flake Snow. I did this for the entire layout, covering everything in a coating of white glue and the flake snow. Now, it took an entire canister of flake snow to cover this entire layout with one coating, but this was the first of about 3.5 canisters of flake snow that I would use on this side of the layout. While you could just go ahead and do one coating and get away with it, I really wanted a much thicker layer of snow, and so that is why I eventually ended up placing 3 to 4 coats of the flake snow in place on that side of the layout. But while I was waiting for those additional canisters of flake snow to arrive, I worked on the foam side of the layout. Took a blowtorch and kind of melted down the area where I planned to put the pond as well as the edges of the foam. I mixed up a batch of Sculptamold, added some brown paint to give it a little bit of color, and then applied that around the 4 feet and the edges of the foam board all around the perimeter of the layout, as well as on the basin for the lake area. Now, it does take a while for Sculptamold to dry, and because it was cool and damp, it took several days for all the Sculptamold to dry. But I needed to make progress to get this layout done in time for the holiday season, so I painted a layer of brown paint on all the areas that were dry or didn't have any Sculptamold on them, so I could proceed to getting all the track work installed. So once that paint was dry, I just assembled all the Atlas track that I used on this side of the layout. Again, it's 036 curves and then 2 straight sections on each side. I did use 1 terminal track piece as well to supply power to this loop of track. I just used regular wood glue to attach the track in place, and so I just ran a bead of glue underneath where the track was situated, and then spread that out into a nice smooth thin layer, dropped the track in place, and kept working my way around the perimeter of the layout. And then I used some small 1.5-inch brads and pushed those in place through the holes in the track to help secure it in place while the glue dried. Next, I went ahead and painted all of the trim of the layout with a nice semi-gloss black paint to help make the edge of the layout look a little bit more finished. This would be the first of about 3 coats of paint that I did put on the perimeter of this layout. You could obviously just stain the wood or use a different color, but my personal preference for the trim on a lot of my layouts is to use black. I just like the way that it looks. Now, for the trees on both sides of the layout, I picked up a couple of these ready-made value pack trees from Woodland Scenics, and these trees are pretty durable. You're not going to really damage these too easily, and they do come with these plastic bases, and so I took all those plastic bases, arranged them how I wanted them on the layout, and then glued those in place with some more wood glue. I also have some of these other trees that are kind of more of the Christmassy type looking trees. I have either glitter or paint or whatever else on them, and I just kind of was arranging those to see how I might place everything once I finished all the other work. Once I had the bases for those trees glued down, I once again painted everything with a layer of diluted white glue, covering all the areas of the layout, and then once again it was time to sprinkle on another canister of the Woodland Scenics Flake Snow. Again, at this point it was getting close to the way that I wanted it to look. Everything was kind of getting smoothed out and making everything look a little bit more like deep snow. Now for the feet on this layout, I use these stick-on felt pads. I didn't want to have just those bare wood feet because that would potentially scratch the flooring, and so I did use these stick-on felt feet. Now I had to cut them to match the size of those oval shape feet that I had already attached to the layout, and so I cut down a piece of cardboard to match the size of those feet, and then use that as a template to cut out these actual felt pieces that I was going to glue down onto those feet. So I cut down 4 oval-shaped pads for this side of the layout and just stuck those in place. While I do have an adhesive backing, I did apply a little bit of super glue as well to help make sure they don't eventually peel off. And so once those were stuck in place, it was time for yet another coating of diluted white glue on the entire side of the layout. And then once again, another coating of the Woodland Scenics Flake Snow. Once that dried, I flipped the layout over and I started working on the scenery on the other side because all the areas of sculpting mold had finally dried. And just like on the snow side, I painted everything with some diluted white glue. And then I just sprinkled on all my various scenery materials. So first I put down a dirt mix on some of the corners as well as on the pond area. Then I used a Woodland Scenics Earth Blend, covered everything with that. And then I made a road area using some cinders going from the track to the higher middle section of the layout. Sprinkled on a layer of the green blend from Woodland Scenics, and then worked on applying a layer of Woodland Scenics medium gray ballast to all the track areas. Now the one canister of that ballast wasn't quite enough to really cover everything like I wanted to, so I eventually did have to come back and I used an additional coating of ballast on most areas that was from Scenic Express, and so it wasn't quite the same color, but I just used what I had. I used also a couple colors of coarse turf and applied that to various areas of the layout as well. To help secure everything in place, I went around the layout spraying everything down with rubbing alcohol as a wetting agent, and then dribbling on more diluted white glue. I started using an eyedropper, and that obviously was a very slow, tedious process, so eventually I just filled up an old Elmer's glue bottle with the diluted white glue, and then just used that to help quickly dribble on the glue mix to all the areas of the layout. And then everywhere where there was a lot of standing glue, I just sprinkled on more of the earth and grass blends from Woodland Scenics to help kind of soak up that extra glue. Once everything was dry, I went to the lake area, took a camo brown and a flat black paint, and just helped darken up the interior of that lake area to make the center part of that lake look deeper by painting the bottom of it blacker. To attach the trees on this side of the layout, I just took some white styrene tubing. I used tubing that had an interior diameter that pretty much matched the wire trunks of the Woodland Scenics trees, cut the pieces down to 1-inch lengths, and then stuck them in the foam in different areas of the layout. And once those were glued in place, I painted all the styrene tubes with just a plain brown paint, so it would be fairly unobtrusive when you didn't have the trees in place. With that done, I just went around touching up the scenery in different places, adding bits of ground foam or other material just to kind of fill in any little gaps or areas that needed to be touched up. I added the felt pads to this side, this time using a darker brown, and then painted some extra paint around the perimeter of those felt pads and added more ground foam to really blend in those pads to the surrounding scenery. With the project nearly done, it was time to work on the resin water for the lake. So I took 2 cups, put a mark on each of the cups that were the same height, and then filled one of those cups up with the actual resin and one with the hardener, and then went back and forth pouring 1 cup into the other cup, mixing everything, and then pouring everything back into the first cup and going back and forth to make sure that resin and hardener was very well mixed. I did add a little bit of black paint and a darker blue paint to color the resin, but I really overdid the black. You really don't need much, only a couple drops, and I put in a little bit too much. So the water was darker than I wanted, but in the end, I think it works out fine. Anyway, I poured that mix of resin into the lake bed, and it didn't go nearly as far as I thought. I thought I would have a deeper layer of resin, but it was just enough to coat everything in the area that I wanted. I might eventually go back and add another layer of resin on top of this one, but for now it was fine. I used my blowtorch to pop all the bubbles and came back and did that a couple times while the resin cured. And here you can see all the base scenery pretty much done. But anyway, with that, the layout was basically done. So I installed all the trees on the bases on the snow side, used some of our Lego structures and the stand for our Christmas tree to kind of show you what this will look like. We actually do have more Lego structures than shown here, and so we'll eventually arrange things and add more decorations to this, but you can see how everything looks on the Christmas side of the layout. And again, the great feature of this layout is that you can take all those decorations off, flip the layout over, and then set it up as a summer theme. We also have a Lego Hogwarts castle, and so I did make the center base area of this layout just the right size to fit that Lego Hogwarts castle. I think it's really cool to have the castle on there, as well as the additional trees, and to have the Hogwarts Express train and going around the Hogwarts castle. Now, I built this reversible layout using O-gauge track, but you could obviously do it with HO track or N-scale track, and certainly building a small N-scale layout that was reversible like this would be a fun project as well. You could have one side be a rural scene and one side be a town scene or something like that, and be able to flip it over and have different types of layouts to display. And so I think it could be a fun idea for certain types of projects. Anyway, I hope you like this project, and hopefully it gave you some ideas that you might want to use on your own projects going forward. But anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching.